The cold was a terrible enemy, but it fell upon the Chinese as well as the Americans. 90% of them had frostbite. And they had crushing problems. The day was almost denied them by UN air power. Communications and supply were abysmal. A Chinese officer wrote, "Our soldiers frequently starve. They ate cold food, and some had only a few potatoes in 2 days."
The mood at that time was, we'd had it. The 2nd Division blocking force had been decimated. I mean, really, it had been torn to pieces by the Chinese. And we came back into position south of the 38th parallel, defeated in every sense of the word.
The retreat tumbled backwards until the Chinese assault, unable to overtake the fleeing trucks of its prey, had outrun its supplies. But by now, the southern capital of Seoul was threatened again. The 8th Army's lines would not solidify until they were 50 miles south of the 38th parallel. An unimpressed foreign observer wrote of the American forces, "They've never studied or been taught defense. They appear only to have studied mechanized and mechanical advances at great speed. They do not understand locality defense in depth or all-around defense. Americans do not understand infiltration and feel very naked when anybody threatens their flanks or rear." Bitter letters home summed up the feeling of many troops and spread to the population at home. A Bronx private wrote, "The Chinese are kicking hell out of the US Army. If the big wheels in Washington decide to fight here, it'll be the biggest mistake they ever made. We all feel we've been let down by our incompetent, blundering leadership from the White House down." Adding to the glum depression of these desperate hours was an escalating, sometimes irrational fury. Inevitably, this rage cried out for the use of the ultimate weapon.
President Truman was tricked into being asked at a press conference whether he would use the atomic bomb to redress our defeat. He said he just might, and not only he might, but he would get General MacArthur to decide whether to use it.
At this frightening turn, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee sped to Washington to head off a nuclear war with China. By now, the United States was willing to settle for a UN truce proposal restoring the pre-war borders of Korea, already a massive reversal of position. Also, Attlee argued to Truman that offering a UN seat to China represented the powerful negotiating carrot that would make the Chinese accept. An increasingly rancorous Congress and public was showing that they had had their fill of Korea. They demanded the administration make reasonable steps to end the fighting. But Secretary of State Dean Acheson knew that in the past, the Chinese had refused to bargain with the UN until they had been made members. He took a calculated risk that this stubborn short-sightedness would hold, and he agreed to the UN proposal that the United States did not want. His gamble succeeded as the Chinese spurned the offer.
Because the Chinese did turn it down, and then the United States, through Acheson, then could say that China was an aggressive nation, and he was able to get a motion through the United Nations calling the Chinese aggressors.
Quietly, out of sight of their allies, the US Air Force began assembling nuclear target lists. The B-29s were ready to fly again. Senator McCarthy and his supporters were calling wildly for drastic action.
Mr. Chairman, I am getting rather sick of being interrupted in the middle of a sentence. Now, Mr. Chairman, do I have the floor? Now we're going on. What possibility of this ending except by victory or by death for this civilization?
They held the administration to be traitorous and responsible for humiliation on the battlefield, and called for the impeachment of Truman and the resignation of Marshall and Atchison. MacArthur sensed the administration's weakness and became increasingly hard to control, even as age and the shock of defeat began to edge him further from reality. It began to seem as though it would depend on the ability of the crumbling forces on the Korean line to stem the Chinese assault, as to whether or not the world was about to descend into a new nuclear nightmare. The American outlook for the Korean War seemed unrelievedly bleak. Any stabilization of the line south of the 38th parallel seemed more a function of the Chinese outrunning their supply lines than of any effective defense. Demoralized UN troops saw little likelihood of holding on once the determined and resolute enemy regrouped and resumed his pressure. Being captured was a terrifying experience, as treatment ranged from strictly proper to instant execution.
They put us in a little village one night, and I heard gunfire, and I thought that our troops were coming in. And the door opened, and it was North Korean with one of our submachine guns. Stuck it in the door, and I happened to be next to the door, and he had the submachine gun right at my head, and I could feel a heat. I later found out that he had slaughtered about 20 of our guys in the hut next to us. And either the good Lord grabbed him or one of the Chinese grabbed him and pulled him away. And they took us back over from the North Koreans. The Chinese took us back.
Ironically, a tragic event in mid-December, the death of a genuine hero of 2 American wars, was instrumental to a turnaround of the fighting. Nobody had ever doubted the courage and tenacity of General Walton Walker.
He was a small man in stature, but he was a mighty general. And he did a magnificent job in the early days, in the difficult early days of the war.
But commanding the 8th Army as it fell back, he was exhausted, and the huge retreat seemed beyond his experience. Morale fell at his headquarters and in his army as rumors rose that MacArthur was considering replacing the popular officer. On the 23rd of December, Walker had been driving from his headquarters when a truck cut off his jeep. In an eerie repetition of the death of his mentor, George Patton, the fighting general died outside of battle, in a mundane traffic accident. At this critical moment, General MacArthur made the very last of the brilliant and fateful decisions that had starred his fabled career. He replaced Walker with a bloody-minded warrior of dash and genius. General Matthew Bunker Ridgway had risen from lieutenant colonel to commanding general of the ferocious 82nd Airborne Division fighting in Sicily and Normandy. In 1944, he commanded airborne troops in the Ardennes. He possessed courage, brains, and decisiveness in abundance.
Ridgway put it back together. Ridgway is my nomination for the greatest fighting general, American general of the 20th century.
Ridgway's plan to get a counteroffensive going instantly were dashed by his first inspection. He wrote later, "This was a bewildered army, not sure of itself or its leaders, not sure what they were doing there, wondering when they would hear the whistle of that homebound transport." He wrote of his dismay at the lack of leadership and what he called the timidity about getting off the scanty roads, the reluctance to move without radio and telephone contact, and the lack of imagination in dealing with a foe whom they soon outmatched in firepower and dominated in the air and on the surrounding seas. Ridgway was going to have his hands full to overflowing.
The 8th Army G3 briefed him on the withdrawal plan, and Ridgway relieved him on the spot.
Reinforcements were arriving, but the cold and dehumanized replacement system called the pipeline was a miserable drag on morale. Individuals who had been together since basic training were torn away from their buddies.
The pipeline was designed to fill up holes in forces that needed to be filled up, but the individual was not considered to be important.
General MacArthur now opened a second front in the war, this one against his political commanders. Repeatedly he leaked and sometimes roared his messages over their heads to reach what he saw as a supportive American public. Truman issued a presidential order to U.S. military commanders demanding extreme caution in all public pronouncements, which would have to be cleared with the Departments of State or Defense. He wanted no widening of this war. MacArthur called endlessly for more troops, more weapons, for carrying the war to the Chinese mainland with bombers and naval bombardment, for a blockade of the Chinese coast. He accused the Joint Chiefs of Staff of crippling his plans. He was a force of nature in the American psyche.
He started to lose some of his luster, particularly in Europe, who felt that this was a madman who was going to be slinging atom bombs around. And he certainly had lost his luster in the White House and over in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but he had lost none of his luster with the American people.
When Ridgway took over the Army, he had to reinstitute all of the fundamentals of infantry, complete perimeters, laying in machine guns at the right positions, ensuring that you used your firepower. All the fundamentals, all of the basics had to be stressed. Within 2 or 3 weeks, you could see the progress. Ridgway was adamant to get an offensive going. And as soon as he could, he started pushing the 8th Army north. And it was necessary to do that for the morale of those troops, for their fighting esprit, because he was dealing with a broken army.
Apart from Ridgway, no one imagined that very soon it would be the Chinese army's turn to be on the wrong end of the deadly surprises. Mao's expectation of a quick victory was bitterly wrong. With both sides having squandered solid chances for advantageous truces, the Korean War would stretch on into its 2 bloodiest